Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of A.K. Rumanajan, or at least the two poems that are anthologized in the Norton Anthology of English Literature. I want to say, to start out with, it seems to me that Rumanajan is not really an English poet as such, either in the sense of ethnically English or in the sense of like poets from around or writers from around the British Empire who went to the United Kingdom and made a life there. It seems that from the introduction that the Norton gives us, it seems that Rumanajan was born in India, in Mysore, and then later in life he emigrated to the United States. However, he was born in 1929 in India, and so he was born under the British Raj, and so I guess in that sense, he fits in the Anthology of English Literature. Anyway, Rumanajan is really much more of an Indian modernist poet. He's really interested in these ideas sort of rooted in Hindu philosophy, Buddhist philosophy about temporality, the changeability of life, of existence, the blending of different elements to make wholes, and the sort of instability of those blendings, not instability necessarily, but the fluidity, the changeability of those constellations of identity. So there's two poems that Norton has included here, Self-Portrait and Elements of Composition, both of which have to do with the sort of contingency or the variability of identity. So I really like Self-Portrait. I think this is actually a really, really good short poem. So this is Self-Portrait. I resemble everyone but myself and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. So this idea of I resemble everyone but myself, the first line and a half, I think is really an interesting paradox here. A sort of evocation of universalism, right? The idea of the fraternity of humanity in some ways, that we are all interconnected, that we are all on some fundamental level the same, and yet there's also the dissolution of the self. Everyone but myself. The erasure, not erasure necessarily, but the instability, the not failure, that's the wrong word. I guess philosophical perspective that the self is a transitory illusion, right? That something larger, some sort of larger cosmological force exists at the level of truth. And I don't know that much about Hindu philosophy. I'm going to be upfront about that, but my understanding is that in the Hindu conception of reincarnation, part of the idea is that the soul or the spirit or the essence, whatever it is, when the body dies, the self is sort of transmuted back into a cosmological whole, a galactic unity, a singularity out of which individual avatars come. So the individual self that we know in this life is an avatar of sort of cosmic self, cosmological self. Now, if I'm completely butchering Hindu philosophy, please let me know in the comments. It is not something I know a tremendous amount about. But that's my understanding of that sort of principle. The foundational principle of reincarnation is that everything exists as a unity, and portions of that unity separate out to become individual subjects or beings or whatever it is. And so I see that sort of reflected here. This idea of the self as a universality as opposed to the sort of Western traditional idea of the individual as atomized unit. That is, I am me, and I am a separate, distinct existential being from the rest of the universe. So that idea of I resemble everyone but myself, I think is really an interesting one. It's a fundamental sort of difference from the Western tradition of looking at the self and the sort of individualist ethos that we in the West tend to have. Elements of composition, the other poem reprinted here, is very similar themes about the sort of collective, almost collaged nature of the self. So I'll read you the first couple of stanzas, and then I want to skip through because there's a number of stanzas in this poem. So I'm going to read you just bits and pieces of it. So the first 3 stanzas. Composed as I am like others of elements of certain well-known lists, father's seed and mother's egg, gathering earth, air, fire, mostly water into a mulberry mass, molding calcium, carbon, even gold, magnesium, and such, into a chattering self tangled in love and work. So right from these opening stanzas, we get this sense of all of these different elements, both in the sense of like periodic table elements, but also in the sense of the more general sense of the term elements, meaning components of a composition, that all of these things come together into the self. So the self is not this unitary single thing. It is this composite being. Father's seed and mother's egg, earth, air, fire, water, calcium, carbon, gold, magnesium, love, and work. So all of these things come together to make the self, rather than the self sort of just being a single unified thing that exists in and of itself. It's a whole history of elemental components that have much, much longer histories than the individual self does, right? So later in the poem, he makes reference, for instance, to millennia of fossil records of insects that do not last a day. This ancient history. I mean, because, right, it was Carl Sagan who said something to the effect of, we are all composed of stardust, or something like that. And this is sort of the idea here, is that out of the entirety of the universe, the things have come together to form the individual, but those things themselves have much longer histories and futures than we as individual human beings will have. The fossil records of insects that do not last a day, the incredibly short lifespan of the individual, but the near eternal record of that, the imprint of that being in the universe. And then, of course, because those rocks break down into their elemental components, they can reform. Sedimentary rocks, for instance, are reformed They're newly formed rocks from older bits and pieces of rocks and things like that. And so the idea of constant change and yet constant unity as everything swirls together to make up existence is really central to this poem. And then we get that sense really at the end, this idea that it's not only a sort of abstract conception that things in existence break down and reform other things, but that is the destiny of the individual as well. So in the last three stanzas, we have, and even as I add, I lose, decompose into my elements, into other names and forms, past and passing tenses without time, caterpillar on a leaf, eating, being eaten. And that last bit, caterpillar on a leaf, eating, being eaten, according to the Norton footnotes, according to a poem in the ancient Sanskrit Taittiriya Upanishad, what eats is eaten, and what's eaten eats in turn. And Rumanajan translated this in his essay. This is Rumanajan's translation from his essay, Some Thoughts on Non-Western Classics. And so there is the sort of bringing into this poem of a traditional element of Sanskrit literature. The poem itself, Rumanajan's poem itself, builds into this practice of the things that exist. Who we are is composed of our precedents, of the elements that have come before us and unified to create us.